Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is an honor to rise today and speak amongst my distinguished colleagues on a topic of significance to the people of my district. Due to the nature of the budget before us today, I rise to speak on behalf of my district to express profound disappointment. I believe that it was 2011 that I made my first protest sign. I don't remember protesting anything prior to that day, and I barely remember how we decided to pack up the kids in the car and head to Madison. It was cold and not normally what I'd wake up to do with two small children on a Saturday, especially in the middle of winter in Wisconsin, but we believed that we needed to go, and so we did. My husband and I looked around for things we could write on, found some old poster board, who even knows what we attached that poster board to, and somehow, somewhere, we found some paint. Red and blue on white poster board felt right to us because we believe that peacefully protesting your government when you disagree is a fundamental right and can be deeply patriotic. And so we painted our protest signs, we put our kids in the car, and we took off to Madison. And while I'm not sure what I expected to get out of that day, what I didn't expect was to feel the feet of my young son, still in a car seat, kicking me as he screamed and cried out of anger and grief as we drove along the highway because he, at 7 years old, had identified a significant personal loss in the cuts to his school funding, and he was devastated. I still remember those feet in my back often when I drive to this building. One of those strange things to me in the last few months as we've discussed this budget is that it doesn't seem to have resonated with this body how personal the budget is, how personal what we do in this room can be to the people, to the children back home. And the reason that my son was so upset was because he had heard his elementary school might lose their librarian as part of the repercussions of legislative action and actions by the former governor. The librarian to my boy, who learned to read at 19 months old and became an avid Tolkien reader before he left his car seat, was a window to his imagination, and that little boy's world felt threatened by a government that he hadn't even learned about yet. He was angry, he was sad, and he was profoundly disappointed. Mr. Speaker, it is a profound disappointment that a decade later we are still having the same fights about funding public schools. The people of this state have been clear that public school funding is a priority. The people, statewide, elected Tony Evers, the education governor, and yet here we are once again with a budget before us that does not sufficiently fund the public schools. There are a number of ways that this budget fails to fund our schools. I am profoundly disappointed that the federal relief funds supplied one time by the federal government to help schools recover from a worldwide pandemic are expected to be used to fund sustainable long-term school budgets. This is a fiscally irresponsible expectation from the Republican Party. I am also profoundly disappointed that those funds are being dishonestly explained to the public by Republicans as school funding. The federal funds, the Biden bucks, aren't meant to fund sustainable long-term school budgets. They are meant as COVID relief funds. They are being sent by the federal government to cover the costs of a pandemic, not the costs of a normal school district's budget. This is all dangerous accounting that I am surprised passed any CPA caucus at all. I am profoundly disappointed that the Republican members of the Committee on Joint Finance have looked at Wisconsinites still reeling from, for many, the most difficult year of their lives, and have sent us a budget that does not seem to engage with anything any of us have just endured. How is anyone in the state supposed to take the Republican Party seriously in light of this budget? How is anyone supposed to believe that there remains compassion in conservatism? It is in very possibly our greatest time of need, Wisconsin's public school children have been abandoned by the Republican Party. It has been a hard year, a dark year, for many a very sad year, for most a very scary year, and for all an anxiety-ridden and traumatizing year. As we face a dangerous pandemic, we lost more than 7,000 Wisconsinites. We feared for our lives, our health, our mental health, the health and mental health of our loved ones and neighbors, and schools and teachers and administrators and families endured likely the most difficult year in the modern history of education in America. It was devastatingly sad to hear my young son kicking and screaming in the back seat 10 years ago. Any mother knows the pain our bodies feel when our children are hurting. It's not a pain our bodies forget. And I can feel it like it was yesterday. I will tell you, it concerns me to look into the faces of my children, other people's children, teachers, administrators, parents, when they express that they have just endured this past monster of a year, did their best to keep everyone safe, educate, learn, carry the burdens of their own families, held desperately to the light of the end of the tunnel, and then finally came out on the other side, and the Republican-led legislature has abandoned our public schools. And not only that, Mr. Speaker, your party's talking points aren't honest. It is dishonest to say that you've hit the long-awaited 2/3 funding if you do not lift the cap so that the money can be spent. It is dishonest to say that this funding is school funding and it's property tax relief when we know it's only property tax relief. It is dishonest to say that you cannot increase special ed funding beyond 30% when we know we have the most significant surplus of our lifetimes. And it is dishonest to say that you're sacrificing money that could be spent on our schools to hide it away in a rainy day fund, saying in case of a pandemic, when we are in a pandemic right now. The money isn't being spent. It wasn't spent last year when we needed it most, and you've given us nothing to trust that you'll spend it in an emergency. It has been raining for 15 months, and you haven't touched the rainy day fund, but here we are watching you move cash into it as the raindrops soak into our clothes. It has been an incredibly hard year, and to land on this side and see school funding treated as a political football so the majority party can fight with the governor is an absolute insult to every single one of us that has endured the last year, and I am profoundly disappointed. Last summer, when we thought we knew we couldn't safely knock doors, I launched a postcard writing campaign, creating space for people to talk about their values. While I expected was adults to grab some postcards and write to their neighbors about the election, what I didn't expect was the interest of children to do the same. And I should clarify, it wasn't parents asking children if they wanted to, it was children seeing what their parents were doing and simply and very matter-of-factly wondering where their postcards were. Of course, I loved this because I adore children, but I was really stunned and frozen in the moment when I was asked, hey, Elliot can't write yet, so he's asked if he can draw pictures of what he cares about, and then I can put some words next to it. And then I heard the same from a parent, and another, and another. People in my district last year received postcards with children's drawings because the children very naturally wanted to engage, and guess what? Kids know their schools, they love their schools, they care that their politicians love their schools. And so they sent postcards in support of their schools. And as I stand here today, that matters to me. And I'm here today to ask you, Mr. Speaker, to tune your heart to the children. The high school students know what it's like to feel their classrooms get more crowded as classroom sizes grow. Kids know what it's like to go on winter break only to return to the crayons melting on their desks because the boiler broke and the entire floor of the school melted. The kids know what it's like to watch their very apolitical parents from all parties put on yes shirts in a very uncharacteristic move to go door to door asking people to choose to raise their own taxes because the school buildings are so old that not all children have accessibility to their entire school. And when they experience all of this, they don't understand why they, too, aren't writing the postcards and begging their state government to fund their schools. The feet kicking in my back that day were brutal. But after what I have seen and heard from the district's children over the last year, this budget's worse. I am profoundly disappointed in this budget because we are enduring a once-in-a-century pandemic, but we had hope. We had one of the best vaccine rollouts in the country. We're getting life back under control. Contrary to what many other states are experiencing, we have an unprecedented budget surplus. And so we are in this moment with so much opportunity. And Mr. Speaker, your party is walking away from it. A failure to fund the state's priorities is a failure to lead. And a failure to lead in a time of crisis, it is a failure to lead in a time of opportunity. It is a failure to lead in a moment that, quite frankly, deserves the rejection of partisan bickering. I will wrap it up. Well, cut me off when you want. The people of Wisconsin deserve better than a standoff between a Republican legislature and the governor they hope to oust in 2 years. The people of Wisconsin deserve a budget that honors what they've endured the last year, sacrificed in the last year, and patiently waited for as they emerged from the tunnel expecting the light. Public school funding shouldn't be partisan. Public schools are an economic engine in the state. Public schools are led by, taught by, attended by Democrats and Republicans and independents and libertarians, and schools aren't partisan, and school funding shouldn't be partisan. And we are all, every member of every party, we all deserve better than this. The projected surplus is so large, Mr. Speaker, that we could have funded the governor's priorities and a tax cut. We could have done both. We could have funded the public schools, closed the gaps, and funded a tax cut. We could have done both, and we could have looked at the unprecedented projected surplus and exemplified unprecedented bipartisanship, shown these kids how parties can work together. But instead, this failure to fund has become a failure to lead. My budget vote, Mr. Speaker, is on behalf of my district, and while I could address a number of shortcomings in this budget, from a failing to fund mental health care and women's health care and violence prevention and transit cuts and removal of every single equity item in the entire governor's proposal and the refusal of Republicans to include a single major proposal from Democrats and a sign of partnership and leadership here in the state, to rejecting Badger Care expansion and abandoning billions of our tax dollars and knowing full well the unemployment system needs massive updates but refusing to properly fund them like other states have done, and knowing that the child care crisis is significant and affects every member of the family, and still refusing significant investment, things that will all keep me up at night. It is the simple, outright refusal to respond to the desperate pleas of my district to increase the $200 per pupil in revenue cap increase that has brought me here today so profoundly disappointed that I'm voting no. My vote today is with deep sorrow. It is that over the last decade, relationships in this building haven't improved. The voices of the people of Wisconsin remain clear but ignored by the majority party, and that the budgets still aren't good enough. A decade ago, I painted a sign and marched around the Capitol in my first act of protest, and today I stand here on behalf of my district, asking and desperately hoping that a decade from now, you finally heard us. Because, Mr. Speaker, if the Republican Party doesn't take seriously its responsibility to sufficiently fund public education, the very real workforce challenge we're facing today isn't going to get better, it's going to get worse. Attracting companies to Wisconsin without fully funded school system for their employees isn't going to get better, it's going to get worse. Knowing that school buildings aren't updated to educate children during a pandemic and refusing to use the surplus to fix that before the next pandemic doesn't mean the situation will get better, it will get worse. Knowing that we have a worker shortage and not investing in the things to attract workers to Wisconsin it's not going to get better, it's going to get worse. And knowing that Wisconsin desperately needs more nurses, dentists, social workers, therapists, and not making sure that we have the schools that they want to move to Wisconsin for their children to attend isn't going to make our healthcare worker shortage situation better, it's going to get worse. And so, the feet in my back as I drove to the Capitol today, reminding me how personal your refusal to sufficiently fund our schools is to the lives that have left me clear on my vote. Over the last 10 years, our public schools have been fighting hard to endure hit after hit from a Republican governor and legislature, and so much so that the state elected a new governor whose priority was to funding the public school system. And after years of enduring hits and cuts, our schools and our teachers and our administrators face the costs of a deadly pandemic. To hold in our hands, a record surplus and a record need, but refuse to fund our schools, is to bury our talent in the sand. Mr. Speaker, the people of Wisconsin have spoken. It is their money, and they want us to invest in the schools, close the gaps, assure every child a world-class education. They've spoken, and they deserve better leadership than this. Public education is an economic engine of the state. Our public schools are windows for our children's imaginations. Our teachers are heroes, and our schools deserve better. The vote is no. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.